Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 5 of Christian Emotional Recovery. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and this episode we are going to talk about the 4 trauma responses and how to overcome them. The 4 trauma responses and how to overcome them. First, if you haven't, please go check out my YouTube channel, which I will link below. Keep in mind that the YouTube channel is different than what you have on the podcast for the most part. Every once in a while, I'll have a crossover episode, and the topics tend to be more specialized on there. So check out the YouTube channel and subscribe to that. Also, if you'd like to support what I do, I'll admit that, like I said, it's difficult to do everything that I do, and trying to find work and do this and keep up with everything with health issues can be challenging. So if you'd like to support the podcast, help me to be able to help more people and support other trauma survivors like yourself, please click on the Patreon button below. I'll put the link in the show notes below, and you can click on that. And also check out my Facebook group, the Facebook group for Christian Emotional Recovery, if you would like weekly encouragement as well as community and support from other people like you. So check those out in the show notes below. Also, as always, if you want to look at any of the sources that I use for this podcast episode, go check the show notes out. I always credit all my sources, and you can read more about the trauma responses and look at the visuals that I used as sources for this as well. But I want to just go ahead and jump in. So the 4 trauma responses and how to overcome them. This is Season 3, Episode 5. And what I want to talk about today is, what are the 4 trauma responses? How do they affect you? How do you know which response you're having? Which one are you most prone to? So ask yourself those questions as you go through this. And, what does all this have to do with me? And that's a good question. And so we're going to talk about the 4 trauma responses. We're going to talk about what they are and who is prone to each one, what circumstances and why people respond under those circumstances with that response, and how to work through and overcome these particular responses. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about how all this comes together and just what the significance of the 4 trauma responses are, and how you can, in understanding these, work with them so that you can start to become more aware of them and also be able to respond in a healthy way to them. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So by understanding the 4 responses to trauma, the 4 responses are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. There's some variation on what they are, but that's the basic overall, agreed upon 4 ways that you might respond with trauma or to trauma stimuli. But if you understand the 4 responses to trauma, you can begin to identify how you respond to trauma and take action to become aware of, work on, and overcome your responses from the ground up. The key here is partly changing behavior, and the other key, which is even more important, is to find out what your response is, where it comes from, and heal it from the root. It's also important to note that most people use a combination of these. When I say use, I don't mean like as a tool, but like when you have a major stressor or a trauma trigger, most people will use a combination of these, sometimes more than one at once. Sometimes maybe different responses in different circumstances, and also in response to different people also. So it can vary, but most people do use all of these at certain times, and most people, though, tend to be more prone to one or two of these. So think about that as you're going through, which ones am I most prone to and why? And what does that say about how I need to focus and target my healing tailored to my unique makeup and to my unique situation? We're all different. We're all unique, right? A little bit more, different triggers may also provoke different responses to the same person in different circumstances. For example, one person may argue with you and you may argue back, which is fight. But if someone from your childhood intimidates you, starts an argument with you, you may use one of the other three responses: freeze, flight, or fawn. So it could even depend on the person you're interacting with and the circumstances. And even with one person, your response may be different depending on how the circumstances change. So, like I said, you may also use different responses at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about trauma responses and the nervous system, because all of this comes from the nervous system, and that's what regulates or dysregulates, depending on the situation, how you respond to stimuli, stressors, trauma, and things going on around you, and how you're wired as well. So how all of that came up for you when you were a child will have a lot of impact on how you respond to things based on how you're wired. And that's why we do all this work. That's why we do all this education, because in learning about your neural network, learning about your trauma responses, understanding them, not dwelling on them, but understanding them, that allows you to begin to know what kind of practices to do to help you to rewire that so that you can have healthier responses. And keep in mind, though, that all these responses at times are healthy depending on the situation, but usually they happen in lesser frequency and to a lesser intensity in healthier normal responses. In most cases, that's not always true. Like if you somebody slams their brakes in front of you, of course you're going to have an immediate fight or flight response, and it's going to be really intense, and that's normal, that's good. But it just depends on the circumstances, because some people, when they've been exposed to a lot of trauma or they had an extremely traumatic single event occur in their life, they can end up wired to be in some of these states, which is not healthy. You don't want to stay in these states. You want to stay in a state of regulation more of the time than anything else. And so let's talk a little bit about how trauma works in the nervous system, how these different responses work in the nervous system. So there is an article in Healthline, and it's called Fight, Flight, Freeze, What This Response Means. Fight, Flight, Freeze, What This Response Means. And it's by Kristen Nunez and medically reviewed by Timothy J. Legg. And there's a section here called What's Going On in the Body. So that's the nervous system. And so let's look at that. It says, during a fight, flight, freeze response, I would argue fawn as well, many physiological changes occur. The reaction begins in your amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for perceived fear. An aside here, people with a lot of trauma responses, their amygdala tends to be larger than an average person's, and that's not their fault. But as you rewire your brain, you can actually rewire your higher functions and grow the part of your brain that there's more of a higher function of choice and being able to regulate yourself more. Does that make sense? So it says the amygdala responds by sending signals to the hypothalamus, which stimulates the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. The ANS consists of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system drives the fight or flight response, while the parasympathetic nervous system drives freezing. How you react depends on which system dominates the response at the time. So it's important to understand why and how this happens in your body so you can know what's going on. And I've found that knowing what's going on actually reduces your stress response, because you get stressed and then you get stressed about stress. But if you understand it, it dials that back some. Plus, understanding it helps you to understand why you do what you do. And that's important. And it says here, in general, when your ANS is stimulated, your body releases adrenaline and cortisol. Those are the stress hormones. And these hormones are released very quickly, which can affect your heart rate. Your heart beats faster. I'm going through this kind of fast. Your lungs, your breathing speeds, your eyes, your peripheral vision increases so you can notice your surroundings. Your ears perk up. Your blood thickens, which increases clotting factors. Your skin might produce more sweat or get cold. Hands and feet, blood flow increases to those. And pain perception, fight or flight temporarily reduces your perception of pain. So your specific physiological reactions depend on how you usually respond to stress. You might also shift between fight or flight and freezing, but this is very difficult to control. Usually your body will return to its natural state after 20 or 30 minutes. There are people where this doesn't happen, and that might be because they've been in those states for so long because of so much trauma that it's difficult to come down. And that's what we're also working on, is to come back to that regulated state more quickly, more regularly, more normally. And that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. So, you might be asking, okay, well, great. What does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with my recovery? That's a great question. So if you have a major history of trauma, either an extremely traumatic single event, like maybe a bad car wreck, a divorce, a major financial loss, the loss of a loved one, and this event was catastrophic especially, you can be more prone to trauma responses. Additionally, if you had sustained experiences of trauma such as narcissistic abuse, childhood emotional abuse or trauma, childhood emotional neglect, sexual or physical abuse, you might be more prone to these responses in exaggerated and sustained ways, and that's not your fault. So I want to read another bit of this Healthline article because it does explain that a little more. What does it mean when you have a lot of trauma? And how does that impact these responses in your body? So there's a section in the Healthline article called Psychological Explanation, and another one called Can This Response Be Overactive? The psychological explanation, it says, while the fight, flight, freeze response causes physiological reactions, it's triggered by a psychological fear. So that's what puts the physical response in motion. The fear is conditioned, which means you've associated a situation or thing with negative experiences. This psychological response is initiated when you're first exposed to the situation and as it develops over time. The thing that you're scared of is called a perceived threat, or I would say a stimuli or a trigger, and something you consider to be dangerous. Perceived threats are different for each person. When you're faced with a perceived threat, your brain thinks you're in danger. And keep in mind, you see how that would mean that if you have these trauma experiences over and over and over again, you would start to look for them because that's how the mind works. And that says that's because it already considers the situation to be life-threatening. As a result, your body automatically reacts with the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response to keep you safe. Examples, slamming on the brakes when a car in front of you suddenly stops, encountering a growling dog while walking outside, jumping out of the way of an oncoming vehicle, getting spooked by someone jumping out of a room, feeling unsafe while walking down the street. Now, those are typical dangers that people can face in everyday life, but it doesn't take something like that to trigger a trauma response, and it also doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you if that's how you respond. Your body is only responding how it should, and it got dysregulated because you were put in situations that you never should have encountered, even though that is the reality of what happened. So, can this response be overactive in Healthline? Sometimes the fight, flight, freeze response is overactive, and this happens when non-threatening situations trigger the reaction. I would argue that they are threatening in your perception, and that does make them valid, but that maybe they're not life-threatening in the real physical sense. So that's not to invalidate anybody's experience. And it says overactive responses are more common in people who have experienced trauma. After a traumatic event, you may develop an exaggerated stress response. It involves a recurrent pattern of reactions related to the initial event. This is more likely if you have a history of PTSD or complex trauma, physical or sexual assault, accidents, experiencing natural disasters, childhood trauma, and stressful life events. In this case, your brain reacts to related triggers to prepare you for future traumatic situations. The result is an overactive response. Great fun, huh? Yeah, but that's how it works. And it's your mind trying to protect you because it doesn't understand. You have to realize something about trauma. When you respond to something, if it's based on a previous experience, with trauma, your mind doesn't know the difference between what happened in the past and a trigger that's happening now. And that's one reason that it happens that way. And that's why separating those two things and bringing that response down helps you to heal from the body level. So it says, an example, if you experience trauma from a car accident. If the sound of a car horn reminds you of the event, you might have a stress response when you hear a car honking. It's logical. There's nothing wrong with you if you respond that way, even if it is an overreaction for the average person, but that's your experience. And then it says anxiety. Anxiety is when you feel scared or nervous about a situation. It's a natural response that helps you react appropriately. If you have an anxiety disorder, you're more likely to feel threatened by non-threatening stressors. This could spark an exaggerated stress response to daily activities like riding the bus or sitting in traffic. And then it talks about how to cope, but we will come back to that. I want to break down each of these trauma responses, how they're different, what causes each one, and how people respond in each situation, and then how to overcome or how to work with each one. I want to talk about the 4 different types of trauma responses now, and I'm going to talk about what each one is, the behaviors and actions that come with that response, who or what types of people use or respond this way, and then how to overcome it. So we'll talk a little bit about how to break each one down. We'll break each one down. So keep in mind, though, that anyone can have any of these reactions, healthy or otherwise, and having them does not make you have any of the conditions listed below. However, if someone displays these behaviors regularly in various circumstances, this may indicate a disordered condition, though not necessarily. It's still best to seek a professional's help before diagnosing yourself or someone else. You know I need to say that, right? So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so the 4 responses are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Let's look at fight first. Fight. That's the one that we're probably the most familiar with because on this channel we've talked a lot about narcissistic abuse and manipulation, and people that tend to this reaction on a consistent level tend to have higher narcissistic traits. Now keep in mind that's not always the case, but that there does tend to be a correlation there, okay? So, who tends to be more prone to the fight response? Narcissists, sociopaths, people with conduct disorders, but anyone can have this response. Even the best people can have this response, sometimes a lot. So keep that in mind, okay? So under what circumstances does somebody go into fight response? When healthy, it might include being assertive, defending yourself under the right circumstances, not allowing someone to abusively cross a boundary, warding off an attack or danger, or protecting yourself. When unhealthy, responses can include outbursts of extreme anger, bullying, criticizing, yelling, and even in some cases, physical violence. So you can see how that has some narcissistic trait connected to it there. And then with fight, when healthy, the fight response allows for assertion and solid boundaries. When unhealthy, for example, when used as a trauma response, it's an act of self-preservation function where you move reactively toward conflict with anger and aggression. It's a fear state where you confront the threat to stand up for and assert yourself. And that comes from The Art of Healing. That's one of the sources I used. It's The Art of Healing. So I'll put that in the show notes. And that was a quote from The Art of Healing. So So why do people go into fight response? Like I said, it's not just narcissists abusing people. That's definitely not the gist of the whole situation. There are healthy responses, and we have that in our bodies for a reason. But so why does it happen? So defending one's own or another's safety is one reason. If there's a threat or a perceived threat. For example, if you're walking on a path with your children and a bear comes out of the woods, even if he's just sniffing around, that you're going to get into that response, right? You're going to be mama bear yourself or daddy bear yourself. So that's a healthy response. Of course, you're going to protect yourself, your children, or whoever is in your care. It's an active self-preservation function in that case, and that's good. Protecting yourself and protecting your health in some cases, or setting a boundary can get to that response if somebody's trying to aggressively cross your boundary. And it's standing your ground may require some fight in some cases, and that can be healthy. Emotionally unhealthy people may also have this response. Abusive people may use it in unhealthy ways if they feel threatened to intimidate other people, whether the threat is just perceived or it's real. Okay? So, when does the fight response occur? So this is in WebMD. There's an article called "What Does Fight, Flight, Freeze, Fawn Mean?" And that's in WebMD. What does fight, flight, freeze, fawn mean? And it's an article by Martin Taylor, reviewed by Poonam Sachdev. I hope I said that right. Poonam Sachdev. But the fight response happens when your body feels that it is in danger and believes you can overpower the threat. You'll respond in fight mode. Your brain releases signals to your body, preparing it for physical demands of fighting. Here are some of the responses in your body: tight jaw, grinding teeth, urge to punch someone or something in some cases, a feeling of intense anger, need to stomp or kick, crying in anger, burning or knotted sensation in your stomach, and attacking the source of danger. So some of those are healthy in some circumstances, but when they're not healthy, those are some of the responses that can occur as well. So what do you do to overcome the fight response? Like we said, sometimes it's healthy and sometimes you need to be in that response, and that's okay. But there are times when it's not healthy, and there are people who respond that way in situations where it doesn't really render that response. And so how do you deal with that? All right, so this is an article in Complex Trauma Healing, and it's the 4F Trauma Personality Types and Recovery. That's a website called Complex Trauma Healing, and it's the 4F Trauma Personality Types and Recovery. I don't see an author right here, but there is, I'll put the link below for this article as well. But this one talks about how do you heal from or work on your fight response. First, you need to understand the cost of power that causes abandonment from intimate interactions. Redirect the rage towards the awful childhood circumstances. Grieve to release hurt rather than polarizing to anger it out. Shrink the outer critic demanding perfection from others. Develop mindfulness about needs, rights, and feelings of intimates. And take self-initiation timeouts. In other words, take a timeout that you initiate. And adapt to using other 4F responses, especially the Fawn's empathy. Like Fawn's empathy. I don't know what that is, but this article is here, and I'll let you look at that. I have looked through it, but it's hard to remember all this stuff. So you can look at this is an article with a bunch of charts, and I love charts, so I will leave that for you to have access to in the show notes. This is a great article. Okay, so that's the fight response. The fight response, I talked about who is prone to it, under what circumstances it occurs and when, and also why people respond this way and how to deal with it when it comes, how to overcome it. Now, I know it's like, well, that's easier said than done. Of course, but that's why we have this whole channel. It's the battle's not going to be won in a day. So, it's a little bit at a time, and it's learning these strategies bit by bit and rewiring the brain by doing daily practices. So let's look at the next one, flight. So who is prone to flight? First of all, keep in mind that not everybody who's prone to flight has these conditions, and some people that have these conditions may not use these all the time. But with flight, people that have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, people with mood disorders, bipolar disorder, and ADHD, hyperactive disorder, are people that might use or have a coping mechanism in flight. And just keep in mind that anyone, even the best people, some of whom may fit into those categories and most of whom do not, may have these responses. It's just a human response. We all have this response. It's just that people with certain conditions may be more prone to this response. So this can include, people that have had trauma, experiences as well. So under what circumstances, what are the symptoms of this type of response, of flight? So this can include being a busybody, a workaholic, an overthinker, and it can also include panic, anxiety, perfectionism, and hyperactivity. Those are all signs of flight. And from The Art of Healing, the article, The Art of Healing, it says, when faced with a dangerous situation, the flight response corresponds with avoidant behavior. When you're healthy, you're able to discern a stressful situation and disengage within limits. However, as a trauma response, you take steps further by isolating yourself entirely. So the healthy response is you use this under certain circumstances, one of these responses, and the trauma or the unhealthy response is that it's taken to an extreme. And like I said, that's not always a conscious choice and it's not your fault, but being aware of it can help you to become more able to contact that experience, know why it happens, show yourself empathy, and come back down from that response. So why does flight happen? Why? It says when there is real danger, the situation is getting more intense or confrontational than is healthy, or when someone crosses a boundary and you've made it clear you will leave if the boundary is crossed, these may be healthy responses. Those are my ideas. Anytime that there is a conflict and someone doesn't want to deal with an issue, flight might not be a healthy behavior since it can become avoidant. Some will even socially isolate. Note, though, this is my idea still, that introverts and extroverts are a thing, so this functions on a sliding scale. These are my ideas. To be healthy, all people need to interact with others socially and have a support system of friends, family, acquaintances, church friends, colleagues, significant others, and or neighbors. But introverts may need more alone time to be healthy, and extroverts may need more social time to be healthy. And some alone time for everyone is healthy and needed, but there's a balance even within that sliding scale. And if somebody goes too far to either extreme, then there's probably something not healthy going on there. In the case of flight, it's isolation. In the case of never being alone and never being able to sit with your emotions, that's also an issue. So when does this occur? When does flight occur? So in the WebMD article, there's a section on flight, and I'm going to read that. Thank you for bearing with me. I know I'm reading a lot off of sources, but this is how we learn about responses to things. And in the WebMD article under flight, it says, if your body believes you cannot overcome danger, but can avoid it by running away, you'll respond in flight mode. A surge of hormones like adrenaline give your body the stamina to run from danger longer than you typically could. So keep in mind that this is an evolutionary response. All of these are wired into our DNA, and they're normal. Okay, especially when we lived in the old days and we lived in caves and we had to run from bears and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Now that the lions and tigers and bears that we deal with, sometimes they're real, but usually they're more like social situations and experiences. But it says signs of a flight response include excessive exercising, feeling fidgety, tense, or trapped, constantly moving your legs, feet, or arms, restless body, like restless leg syndrome, even though that can also just be physiological in response to certain medications and stimuli, feeling of numbness in your arms and legs, like the tingly feeling that you get when you get really anxious, dilated, darting eyes. Okay, so those are some of the responses for flight. Now, lastly, in flight, and we'll be halfway through the 4 responses, how to overcome flight response. Keep in mind, as always, sometimes you need this response, and sometimes it's good to have it. If, for example, God forbid, you hear a gunshot and you run, that's good. It's good to do that, Or, if a cougar comes out of the woods and you're on a nature trail and you go the other way, that's probably a good thing too. So, it depends on the circumstances. In the article I was in before, the 4F trauma personality types, under the section on the 4F trauma personality types, there was one on recovery from polarized 4F trauma personality types. Flight. Here are some ways you can work on your flight response when it's not appropriate or not healthy or excessive. Understanding the cost of perfectionism causing self-abandonment. Redirect over-analytical thinking towards childhood losses. Grieve about childhood losses through incessant activity. Shrink the inner critic demanding perfection from self. Develop mindfulness to relax and decrease the habitual doing. Prioritize and engage life at different speeds, including neutral. Introspect about what hurt you are trying to escape from. Okay, so those are some of the ways that you can work on overcoming your flight response. Now we did fight, we did flight, now freeze. These are the 4 F's. This is the third F, freeze. So what is the freeze response? First of all, who has a tendency to get caught in this response more? So people that experience a lot of depression or have a diagnosis of depression, dissociative disorder, ADD, schizophrenic disorder, those are some of the people that tend to have more of a tendency towards the freeze response. Though if your tendency is towards that, that doesn't mean you have any of these conditions. So everyone also has these responses at certain times, and that's healthy. Even the healthiest people have all the responses, as I've said a million times. Even if someone defaults to this response, that doesn't necessarily mean they have one of the conditions listed. So what are the symptoms of freeze? How do you know if you're in freeze response? So some of the behaviors around freeze might be isolating, numbing with addictions, and those addictions aren't just cigarettes and alcohol and drugs. It can also be other addictions like food and pornography and television and excitement and activity. There's a lot of things we can be addicted to, right? Difficulty making decisions, extreme inactivity. So it's the polar opposite of flight. Freeze is just sedentary lifestyle and feeling stuck or numb. So from the Art of Healing, from the article, The Art of Healing, in the show notes, it says, when healthy, the freeze response can help you slow down and appraise the situation carefully to determine the next steps. When unhealthy, the freeze response relates to disassociation and immobilizing behavior. When this defense is enacted, it often is a result of literally freezing, feeling frozen and unable to move, or find yourself spacing out as if you're in a haze or detached from reality. If you don't feel like you're there and you mentally have checked out as if to leave, and so you don't know what's happening in your surroundings and what you're feeling in your body, and that's in an attempt to find emotional safety. That's the gist of freeze. And a little bit more about it. Why does it happen? Why does freeze happen? This is my words. It says, when life gets to be too much, someone may freeze or disassociate, feeling like the moment is not real. Have you ever been like, everybody's spaced out, of course, but if you have trauma, you sometimes just don't feel like life is real. You don't feel like you're in your body. It's like everything is always in a fog and a haze, and you never feel like you're real and your experience is real, and you're kind of detached from reality, almost looking at it metacognitively, like you're outside of it looking in. And you don't feel like you're really there, and you're mentally checked out is what the article said, and that's a good description of it. but you can detach from your body in the moment in an unhealthy way, and it's not intentional. It's conditioned. That's why grounding work and inner child work are so healthy. They bring you back to your sense of self. They bring you back to your body so you can feel real, so you can feel like you're inside your body looking out, not outside looking in. Does that make sense? And that's a good thing. That feels good. You start to feel whole and human, and color and sound and everything don't overwhelm you, but they're so vivid also. And I don't know how to explain it, but as I've healed, everything has just become more real, and it's just this wonderful feeling of feeling fully alive. I also say that someone can even not be able to function in a situation if a situation or response is severe. When a child is abused by an adult, this can happen, or when an animal thinks it can't get away from a predator. That's another time it'll happen. That's evolutionary, and I don't want to get too graphic, but if an animal is trying to get away from a predator and it realizes it's not going to be able to, it goes into freeze and numbs so that it can cope with what's going to happen to it. That's horrible, but that's one of the freeze response reasons for being. It's a response to numb from what's happening to cope. So that's true. You might not get torn apart by an animal, but still something that's difficult and painful, people will disassociate and freeze in order to cope with it because they don't know any other way, or because that's all they can do at the time, depending on the circumstances. And yes, there are healthy situations where people have to do this in extreme cases. This might be, for example, if somebody loses a loved one, this can actually be a healthy response at first. The full experience of what is happening is just too much. And then they slowly, as you grieve, start to open back up to the world and come back into their bodies and accept what's happened. You just can't take in certain things all at once. And the freeze response, the disassociation response, allows you to be able to deal with it and come back gradually as you can. So it does have a function that is healthy and that is necessary. It's just that if you stay there, that's when it's not healthy. So when does freeze occur? I'm going to read the section on freeze in WebMD, and the section on freeze in WebMD says, freeze. The stress response causes you to feel stuck in place. This response happens when your body doesn't think you can fight or flight. So it usually defaults to this once it's tried those other two. Things that happen with the freeze response: a sense of dread, pale skin, feeling stiff, heavy, cold, and numb, loud pounding heart, decreased heart rate. So your body actually begins to shut down and numb. And a lot of the nervous system functions actually slow down. So that's the physical response to freeze. Okay? And then also, how do you overcome freeze? What happens if it's an unhealthy response to a trauma situation or to a series of trauma situations that you're reenacting in your mind? So back in the article, the Polarized 4F Personality Types article, in the Complex Trauma Healing website. So how to overcome freeze. Understand the cost of isolation. Redirect social anxiety towards self-compassion. Grieve about childhood helplessness. Shrink the outer critic attributing imperfections to others. Learn coping skills for disassociation, and establish a therapeutic relationship. In other words, go to therapy and find somebody you can develop trust with to help you with this. Identify relational healing through friends, pets, books, or support groups. So those are ways to connect. Connecting with the outside world in any way that's healthy, connecting with your sensory responses in any way that's healthy, and connecting with other entities. It doesn't even have to be a human, even though that's ideal. Friends, family, therapy, associates, pets, trees, animals, birds, the world around you, all of that is a good way to come out of the freeze response. And to do that a lot helps you to begin to heal that over time. Okay, so that's a little bit about the freeze response and how to overcome it. We're on the last one, okay? This is the fawn response, and some people say this is not one of the 4Fs. I'll leave it to you to decide. I think it is, but fawn is the last one, and fawn is, when you're a people pleaser, when you kind of roll over. I mean, this sounds degrading, and I don't mean it this way, but like, Fawning, if you picture a dog whose tail is like between his legs and he like lays down and he rolls over and he's cowering, that's an extreme unhealthy fawn response. And there are people that do that, maybe not literally, but in a sense they do that with other people, and it's not healthy. It's okay to have a backbone. It's okay to care about yourself. It's okay to set boundaries. You should have a sense of autonomy, agency, and identity. That's part of how God made you, and you need to reclaim those things, and it's okay to be all those things, and you can still be kind to people and do that. I don't know where we get this idea that to be kind to people, you have to roll over. I don't think you have to roll over at all. I think you can be kind and still have a strong sense of identity and boundaries. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't let anybody tell you there is, because there's not. So, fawn, who tends to have the fawn response? Of course, as always, there's always situations where people have these responses, and even healthy people can default to this at times. Is there circumstances where it can be healthy? Maybe, but I think with this one, it might not be as much a healthy response. So codependency is one. People-pleasing, anxious attachment style are all types of fawning, like the types of conditions people may have where there's more fawning involved. Everyone can get this way from time to time and still be a healthy person, and most people will have this response once in a while. Engaging in healthy interdependence and interpersonal relationships still means one has boundaries, but these may vary depending on the familiarity and trustworthiness of the person with whom one is interacting. So how much of a boundary you set up may depend on the person you're interacting with. But interpersonal trust and relationships with worthy people who are healthy is a good thing. Okay? So I'm not saying if you set boundaries, you should just say no to everybody all the time. That's not what I'm saying. But you also don't have to say yes if you don't want to. There's a balance here, I think. There might be times you don't want to do something, but you know the Lord is asking you to do it, and you do it. And it doesn't feel good, but you do it anyway. That's not what I'm talking about either. But if it starts to become this thing where your own will is overridden every time by some higher thing, you have to ask yourself, is this authentic? Is this really what God is telling me to do? Or better yet, is this like, you see what I'm saying? Even the Bible says God loves a cheerful giver. He wants us to want to do the things that we're doing for Him. So that's something to evaluate and consider as well. That's all I'm saying. So what are some of the behaviors of fawning? That can include, like I said, being codependent and people-pleasing, having no boundaries, having little sense of identity, always putting other needs first. Keyword, always. Putting other needs first is godly, but if you never take care of yourself, that's not godly either. It's out of balance. Even if it's at one's own detriment. If it's to your detriment, unless it's an emergency, then you need to question why you're doing it that way. If you have some issues there. Struggling with saying no, FOG. FOG is an acronym for fear, obligation, and guilt towards others. And usually those all work together in tandem. Okay, so those are some of the behaviors of fawn. And from the Art of Healing article, it says, at its core, fawning is about people-pleasing and engaging in pacifying behavior. This is my words. In other words, if you're around somebody who's yelling and shouting and pitching a tantrum and they're acting like a 2-year-old, but they're 40, when you're appeasing them constantly, that is a fawn response. And sometimes it's easier to do that, but in the long run, it can make their behavior worse, unfortunately. And then the article also says, it's characterized by prioritizing people above all else by doing whatever they want to diffuse conflict and receive their approval. It seems good to be well-liked and defer to others to secure safety, but not when it's at the cost of losing yourself. It can reach a point where you abandon yourself and your needs by merging too thoroughly with others. Most likely, you don't feel seen by others and may feel eclipsed by the people in your life. And when you merge too much with others, that's called enmeshment. And enmeshment is not healthy. You need boundaries with other people, even the people you're most intimate with. Enmeshment is not healthy, okay, when it gets to that point. So you need to keep your sense of boundaries because that's how you keep your sense of identity. And you can be intimate with the people you love and still be who you are, okay? So why do people respond with the fawn response? We talked about that a little bit, but in my words, I say when someone has been taught that what they feel, think, or do doesn't matter, children who become adults who experience narcissistic abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and other forms of emotional trauma can be people pleasers because they respond this way to feel safe. Being small, having few boundaries and needs, complying and not speaking up are ways that codependents and people pleasers will respond to people in general, but especially unsafe people. With unsafe people especially, you're scared to rock the boat and speak up when you know you don't like something that's going on. Okay, so that's fawning. So in WebMD, so when does this happen? In WebMD, the section on fawn talks about when this occurs. So it says this response is used after an unsuccessful fight, flight, or freeze attempt. So this is kind of the last one. When you can't get away, when you can't disassociate from the situation, and when you can't fight it off. The fawn response occurs primarily in people who grew up in abusive families or situations. Wow, right? Signs of a fawn response include overagreement, trying to be overly helpful, and primary concern with making someone else happy. If you've ever been around somebody who smothers you with trying to help, that might be why they do it. And if you're like, no thank you, and they keep doing it, it could be a fight response from a narcissist or a manipulator, but in some cases it's somebody who means well and they just don't know when to stop, and it's just their trauma response. So that's something to think about too. What causes the response of a fawner? It occurs in distress and damage when you're feeling due to trauma. Fawning is a common reaction to childhood abuse, and the fawn response is your body's emotional reaction that involves becoming highly agreeable to the person abusing you. The fawn response can cause confusion and guilt if you have PTSD. Even if you're being treated poorly, your instinct drives you to soothe your abuser instead of resorting to fight or flight response. Over-dependence on the opinions of others, little or no boundaries, vulnerability to narcissism and narcissists, and being easily controlled and manipulated are fawn responses, and this is especially common for people who grew up with narcissistic parents, says the WebMD article. You may have been neglected or rejected constantly as a child. Being helpful and agreeable was the only means of survival. So sad, so sad. The problem with the fawn response is that it can cause codependent adults and make you lose your sense of identity. So that's a little bit about the fawn response. How to overcome the fawn response. This is pretty complicated, but it can be done. I've seen people that have healed from it. If you want to see an example, look at Lisa Romano's work. I love her work. Now, her work is not exclusively Christian, but she has some great stuff on codependency. That's one of her specialties. Check out Lisa Romano. Okay, so overcoming it, back in the 4F article that we've been in, how do you overcome a fawn response in trauma? A few things you can do is understand the cost of forfeiting boundaries, rights, and needs. You could do that through journaling, for example. Redirect people-pleasing towards self-compassion. Turn inward more instead of outward. Grieve about childhood situations that happened, like losing your sense of individuality and all the things that happened. Shrink the inner critic voices that are deterring the assertiveness. Develop mindfulness to the fear that triggers the self-abdication. Practice self-expression, authenticity. Reduce the habit of emotional mood mirroring. In other words, be yourself. It's one thing to be empathetic. It's another thing to take on other people's identities entirely. Learn to accept disapproval and learn assertion skills. I can promise you that as you get better at this, you do learn to deal with disapproval better. I still shrink from it. I still have issues with it, and I still have major gaps that I'm trying to fill in. But I can tell you that I really don't care what a lot of people think, that I used to really care what they think. And I don't get triggered by that as much. And I'm so thankful to God for helping me to heal that, because it's amazing. You know, I still have so far to go there, but I've come so far. And God will take you on this journey as well. He will heal you. If you do the work, He will heal you. Okay? So that's a little bit about the fawn response. And those are the 4 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And we talked a little bit about who has a tendency towards these, what happens when you get into that response, how and why and when it happens, and how to overcome when you get into that response or have a tendency towards that response. So just a little bit more about general coping skills, and then we'll wrap this up. There are some strategies that will help you with all of these responses. Keep in mind, of course, that praying prayers about what's going on in your mind, your life, your body, give it to the Lord. Give it to God. That's always most important, and that will actually give you some relief. But God will also lead you to specific strategies that will help you heal from the one that you're dealing with or the combinations you're most prone to. God will help you find the right resources and techniques. Scriptures that can help you address these is another one, to recite those and meditate on those. Just having that embodied relationship with the Lord and having Him sort of surround you with that sort of hug, that warmth, that security, that kindness, that just the relationship of His presence can do so much to help you not feel alienated and isolated, which is, all of these are a product of that, right? God is your anchor. Being guided by the whole and comforted by the Holy Spirit is another one. So coping skills in the WebMD articles, there's a section in that article that talks about 3 techniques on how to cope. And that's in the article, How to Control Fight or Flight in WebMD. I'll put it in the show notes. This is the one I've been referring to several times. But how to cope. So there are 3 techniques you can use to ground you in the present and help you overcome your stress response. One that I mentioned earlier that will help you is a mental grounding techniques. Focusing on your environment, reciting songs, poetry, or affirmations. I would say reading scripture as well. Playing the alphabet game. What I do when I go to sleep at night is I will think of a certain thing, like an animal or a female names or male names or something, and I'll go down the alphabet and try to think of one in each letter. So playing games with yourself, as strange as it sounds, that helps me go to sleep. That might be one that you can do to ground yourself too. Any kind of game like that. Reminding yourself you're safe with safety statements, doing mental calculations, and visually overcoming your fears. So even doing a puzzle or a game can be helpful. Physical grounding techniques include breathing and focusing on your speed and steadiness. Take a deep breath right now. Take a deep breath. Slow down. You breathe in through your nose slowly and naturally, no forcing. Hold it for a couple of seconds and let it out naturally. Doesn't that feel good? Do that 5 or 10 times in a row, not forced, but gently, and it will help you to start to ground and feel better as well. Touching or holding on to an object tightly, putting weight on your heels and physically connecting with the ground, tensing your body and focusing on slowly releasing it from your forehead to your toes. And another one I like to do is give myself a hug. I know it sounds corny, but I'll just put my hands over my arms, and you can probably hear it, but I rub my arms and just squeeze my arms, and I do that a few times, and it helps me feel better. So soothing grounding techniques include thinking about your happy place and relaxing there. Maybe a childhood place or some place you like to go now, or it can even be a fictional place. You can create it in your own mind. That's the beauty of the imagination that God gave us. Treating yourself to something comforting or joyful, even if it's a little chocolate. Repeating coping statements and speaking positive affirmations. Those are different types of grounding techniques, mental, physical, and soothing grounding techniques. And that's from the WebMD article. Last coping strategies that I'll share, and then we'll end for this segment. The Helpline article also talks about how to cope, and in the Helpline article, it talks about relaxation techniques. It says by doing activities that promote relaxation, you can counteract the stress response with relaxation response. Examples of relaxation techniques include deep abdominal breathing, Meditation is one way you can do that. There are breathing meditations. Focusing on a calming word, I think of words like serenity, tranquility. You can even think Jesus or anything like that. Visualizing peaceful images, meditation, repetitive prayer. Now, the scriptures do say don't pray repetitively, but I think that's more like when you say certain things and ask God for them, you don't have to keep saying them over and over and over again. But if a prayer or a certain mantra is calming to you, I think it's okay to say it to help to calm your mind, because even the Bible talks about peace, and that's one of the fruits of the Spirit. Yoga and Tai Chi are two more. Now, those are ones that, once again, I'm not telling you have to do them. I'm not telling you if you should or you shouldn't. That's up to you. That's between you and God. Use your discernment. Pray about it. Read scripture. But I'm not going to say yes or no, that's good or that's bad. From my experience, they've helped me. And if somebody tries to condemn me for that, I'm just like, it's helped me, and I've never had any bad experiences from it. Everybody has to determine that from themselves. Maybe there are certain things in yoga you shouldn't get involved in, and there's some that I haven't. So use your discernment, pray about that, but yoga and Tai Chi can be very soothing and very relaxing, okay? When done regularly, these techniques can help improve how you react to stress. So that was relaxation techniques. Physical activity is another one. Another strategy is regular exercise. Oh my Lord, that helps me so much. Going for a walk in the morning or even in the afternoon helps when I'm going through something so much. Physical activity reduces the stress response by decreasing stress hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol, increasing endorphins, improving calmness, and promoting better sleep. These benefits can increase your mood and sense of relaxation, which helps you cope with stressful scenarios. If you're not in a place where you can do something really strenuous, go for a walk. Do some gentle stretches. It doesn't have to be a 50-minute cardio workout where you're almost ready to pass out. Even though if you can do that, I will argue that will definitely soothe you as well. Social support is the third one after physical activity and relaxation techniques. And it says it's also important to nurture healthy social relationships. Social support can minimize your psychological and physiological reaction to perceived threats. It provides a sense of safety and protection, which makes you feel less fearful. Your social support may include different people, including friends, acquaintances, co-workers, relatives, significant others, and mentors. And so seeing a professional is another possibility, and I encourage you, there is no stigma in this community about seeing a professional. As a matter of fact, if somebody says, I'm seeing a therapist, I'm like, great, good. You don't have to tell anybody if you don't want, but if you want to, you can. But that's up to you. The thing is don't be ashamed to seek help. The people that try to shame people for seeking help should be ashamed of themselves, because there's nothing wrong with seeking help. There's nothing wrong with seeking the help of a therapist or a psychologist or a social worker or anybody who has a clinical experience that can help you with this and is trauma informed. Do it. If you're able to do it and you need it, then go. It's nobody's business but yours and theirs and God's. Go. Okay? Just find the right person. That's all I'm saying. So this is the podcast on overcoming the 4 trauma responses. It's the 4 trauma responses and how to overcome them. And we talked about what the trauma responses were. What do they have to do with you and your experience, me and my experience? We talked about each of the 4: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And then we talked about methods of coping and dealing with and bringing these responses down to a more natural state in terms of your physiology, in terms of your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system. Okay, so understanding the physics behind it helps you to know why it's happening in your body, and it gives you more power. Knowledge is power. There's a reason for that. Okay, but thank you so much for sticking with me. Thank you so much for listening. It's been wonderful talking to you today. I know this was long. I know there were a lot of sources. I've been using a lot of sources because I believe in science, I believe in therapy, and I believe in combining those modalities with our relationship with Christ to help us to have the best chance of overcoming our trauma and living the life God intended for us. Thank God that we live in the modern era and we have access to these resources. And I believe God did give them to us to use. So find out what works for you and explore. If something doesn't work, experiment and try something else. But know, beloved, that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.